Hello, everybody. Your Friendly Death Investigator. Welcome to this newest, I'm not even sure what to call it. I'm doing some new content for the channel, and this is sort of a variation of what I'm going to be getting into. You guys know I do YouTube stuff now. And today is kind of a follow-up for an episode I just did for Tiffany Eunich. And I wanted to... If you're looking for the straight forensic autopsy type stuff, this isn't that. And I just, forewarning, if that's what you like about the show, thank you, because that's why I do the show. But I do like thinking about other parts of the case just for my own, just for me. And this is one of the things I've been wanting to talk about. And to help me do that, I have a special guest with me today. Her name is Ariel Cooksey. And go ahead and introduce yourself, Ariel.
Thanks. Hi, I'm so excited to be on. This is one of my favorite podcasts. And when you asked, it was like, yeah. So yeah, I'm Ariel Cooksey. I host two podcasts. One is Malice, which is my baby. And although we have not yet started to record, I'm taking over as a co-host on Crime and Compulsion. So a couple places you can find me. Malice is basically a podcast that dives into the psychological, sociological, environmental, neurobiological, all of these factors that come together to create violent offenders. Sometimes I do take on cases that are more at like an institutionally violent level, but there are throughout cases that kind of boggle the mind. And the whole question is why? Why do they do these things? So as a social psychologist, I kind of decided that's what I wanted to dig into.
And that's one of the reasons I reached out to you for this case. By the way, check out Malice. It is very much that. It's very much narrative driven. It kind of delves into, it really takes a good hard look at people's pasts. And it doesn't definitively tell you one way or the other, but it really paints a very specific picture sometimes. And Crime and Compulsion is great too. Karen's a sweetheart.
She is. And she's a hell of a writer too. So
I've never seen it. I've seen your writing. Your writing's very good. And
thank you.
But I've never seen hers, but I wouldn't question it. But today, since I already did the case on Tiffany Eunick and sort of told her story, specifically with the work that Ariel does with Malice, is something that I wanted to sort of tackle on with Lionel Tate. Now, Ariel and I have been, just full disclosure, we'd been wanting to collaborate on something for a minute, and it was one thing, and then it was another thing. Some things we won't talk about what came up, but at a certain, then you moved, and then I moved.
And then I moved again, and then you moved again.
Yeah. And then an apartment near you exploded, which is, yeah. But yeah, so lots of things came up, and we were going to talk about this case or then that case. And then I don't really recall how I decided to do the Tiffany Eunick case, because it wasn't about a month or so before I started writing it. It wasn't really on my radar, even though I knew Lionel Tate. And once I started looking into it and got her report, it was very much like, oh, this is where you bring in Ariel, because Lionel Tate is a very, very interesting person. And not just, you'll tell us eventually, Ariel, but he's interesting. But what's more interesting is how the world reacted to him. Because just as a setup, this was 1999, I believe. It could have been 2000. I think it was 99. So I was a very old 13 years old. But I knew his name, but I didn't know much. I knew and cared about as much as a 13-year-old would. And he and I are roughly the same age too, I guess I realized.
That's right.
He might be a little bit older, but roughly the same. And didn't think about it much back then, but it happened around 99. And then whenever I was in college in criminal justice and took juvenile delinquency, wouldn't you know, his name came up again. So he's sort of been passively on my radar for years until I got to Tiffany Eunick's case. And by the time I got to her, I had been doing autopsy, or I'd been a death investigator, and I've been doing autopsy for a while. And it's just a very, very nothing if not unique case of Lionel Tate.
Absolutely.
So I guess we'll start with Tiffany Eunick. She's found, basically how I detailed it in the episode, she's found unresponsive by her, what she referred to as her aunt. And they sort of referred to Lionel as her cousin, but we sort of found out they're not blood related, but they were close family friends. The way I understood it, they immigrated from, I think, Jamaica to South Florida. And I can't recall what Tiffany's mom did, but Lionel's mom was a state patrol officer with Florida. And she was the one that was watching the two of them. And Tiffany's mom was at work, I believe. And it was Lionel's mom who finds Tiffany unresponsive, takes her to the hospital. And this is one of these things that I get confused as in terms of what was reported to the investigators, what the ME knew, because just in experience, when we get these kind of calls, we would often not know. They would like, yeah, we got a little girl in the hospital. You guys want to take a look? And you're like, a girl in the hospital? Is that the whole story? Girl in the hospital? And sometimes it was. And I couldn't make heads or tails if that's what this was, because based on, I think there was a brief synopsis of the medical examiner investigator's report, and it didn't really detail any trauma that the ER found. But ultimately, Tiffany Eunick dies in the ER. Like from the moment she's found deceased and then carried to the ER, it's not very long that she's found. She succumbs to what will eventually be found to be trauma. And they get to doing the autopsy. And again, I just wonder what they knew going into it. But regardless, they find some of the worst kind of trauma you could find in a child. I'm going to try my best to sort of tiptoe around this, because if you want to know what happened to her, you can go listen to the episode. It's pretty brutal. And of course, probably everyone initially was probably looking at Lionel's mom, because it's usually an adult. But come to find out, it was Lionel himself, who I think was then 12.
12. Mm-hmm.
And when he's eventually convicted, he was 13. So they found just massive trauma to Tiffany. And I think they initially questioned Lionel, and I think he admits to some capacity. And this is one of those things, and you'll probably have some insight on this. He admits to some things, but I don't have kids, but if you've ever worked with kids, you kind of know, I mean, and grown-ups do this as well. Kids will give you just enough to try, and not to say he was being deviant, and he probably knew what he did was wrong, but he probably gave them just enough information of like, well, yeah, we were doing this, but he didn't give them everything, we'll say.
You see it a lot in criminal investigations and interrogations where the offender will give you information that may be accurate, but minimizes their role in the violence that occurred. And that's a lot of what Lionel did.
Yes. And just kind of broad examples of that, I guess, just for reference, if you've listened to this show, just cases I've touched on, maybe the Chris Watts, the Watts case. I always refer back to him because the interrogation is so easily available to look at, and it's so fascinating, but it's very much in line with what you're talking about. He gives them just enough of, yeah, it was this and it was this, but I don't know X, Y, and Z. And then they slowly, more and more comes out. But again, there's a difference between an adult doing that and a 12-year-old who, while I would say I'd be curious what his mental state was, but that's the thing, we'll never really know, because as near as I can tell, he was never given any sort of evaluation because it wasn't required.
There are some things that were involved. However, I had no luck finding an actual diagnosis of anything, whether it was a personality disorder or a mental illness.
And this was something I touched on at the end of Tiffany's case, is in the state of Florida, at least then, I don't know how it is now, but back then, and 20 years ago? So take it for what you will. To prove or to get a conviction for, what did he initially get charged or convicted of? Was it first-degree murder?
He was charged with first-degree murder. And I guess for simplicity's sake, we have to consider the common definition of murder, which is the killing of a human being by another human being with malice aforethought. Okay. And what that means is that you have the intention to harm this person. And that could be just the intention to kill a human being, the intention to cause grievous bodily harm, an extreme recklessness or disregard for the value of human life. Any of those things would qualify. Under those rules and guidelines, there's no exclusion for children. Whether they're tried as adults is going to be the real big issue there. And Lionel Tate was. tried as an adult rather than in a juvenile capacity. However, they ended up going back and accepting a plea for second-degree murder, and he did, 3 years?
Yes, something like that.
So I guess the question becomes, at what age or degree of maturity does a child understand and therefore should be held accountable for their actions?
And okay, so they wanted to give him, they initially did give him life without parole. And this was something I did touch on and wanted to mention. So in Florida, at least then, to be convicted of life and sentenced life without parole, it only had to be proven that he was responsible for the death. His mental state in the state of Florida back then, it did not matter. And since the prosecution didn't need that, I think that's why he was never evaluated, because even if the defense did it themselves and tried to bring it up, it would probably be thrown out because they wouldn't need it in terms of that kind of stuff. So that's my assumption of why it wasn't done, which is kind of a travesty. Because again, these cases are rare with kids doing this kind of behavior. So you would almost think like anytime we were going to get any kind of evaluation, it wouldn't be necessarily a waste of resources just to see where this kid was mentally. But back then they didn't need it. So it doesn't seem like they cared to get it. So they didn't get it.
So when we look at Tate up until the point that he committed this murder, he was described as bright, though he had an average IQ. He was considered street smart, which I think is really important. And he had an 8-year history of major behavior problems. Okay, we're talking everything from fighting, assault, lying, stealing, and he had 15 school suspensions.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't know this. This is all documented.
Yes, and he was widely considered a schoolyard bully.
I remember reading that about the bully, and then I remember, because there's always, and I think I just briefly touched on it, like there were some people that said he didn't, but I didn't know about the documented history. So yeah, that paints a very different picture.
Absolutely. And we'll probably delve into some of the reasons behind some of that behavior as we go forward, just to kind of figure out, where did things go wrong? Yeah.
So the things that he admitted to punching her 35 to 40 times in the abdomen, which that's a very specific admission for a 12, 13-year-old. But there was things about that said maybe that admission was coached out of him. I remember reading that. So I think I just vaguely touched on that. But to some capacity, he admitted to punching her, we'll just say. And he admitted to like putting her in, I don't know if he does, I'm going to be giving away like I did watch wrestling as a kid. I literally almost said, it sounds like you did a DDT, and I just was like, nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. But it's basically like almost like you try to get someone in a headlock and then you just slam their head into the ground. And it sounds like he admitted to sort of doing that. And then he said like her head hit a table, but he didn't say he pushed it. He didn't say he did it. He just said her head hit a table, and you're just like, well, what the hell is that supposed to mean? And then he eventually, not in the initial trial, but at some time later, he did admit to there was a spiral staircase in this house. So obviously he couldn't go up too far if he was jumping on her, but he did admit to going up at least some on this staircase and like elbow dropping her or jumping on her or something like that. And also a fact, didn't really touch on this as far as like physics go. He was 100 and what was the specifics? Like
166 pounds.
166 pounds. Yeah. And she's roughly half that size.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, even if he didn't jump off the stairs, like jumping on her, whatever he's doing, even from ground level, that's a lot of pressure on a kid. And again, I didn't want to touch on too much of it, but ultimately like there was like significant, huge lacerations to her liver. And it is real, like of all your organs, the liver is the biggest, and it can take a hit or two. It's not super protected the way your like heart and lungs are. There's no bones around it to protect it. There is some exposure to it. But again, her liver was like almost completely lacerated through. And I
read in a few accounts that there was actually a piece that was free floating in her body.
Yes. A little chunk of it was. Yeah. And that's, again, you don't see that. In all the years I worked and did death investigation stuff, I mean, I saw child abuse cases, I saw battered kids, but a liver like that messed up, I mean, that takes a beating. And again, another reason I wanted to talk about Lionel, I guess it's because I grew up in that era. I remember everything in the late 90s. Everything was, it was Marilyn Manson's fault. It was pro wrestling's fault. It was Eminem's fault. And there was probably one or two others, but those were your big guys that everybody was going after. And of course, pro wrestling just fit the bill in terms of finger pointing. And that's whenever I say media firestorms, that's all it is. It is a finger pointing game of whose fault is this? When at the end of the day, like, what's most curious is Lionel himself, because there aren't wrestlers showing up on TV and saying, hey, try this. Hey, do this. You watch it. It's like anything you watch. It's like TV, movies. And I've always hated this argument of causality for this kind of stuff. When it's like, clearly there's something more to it than just, oh, I saw a thing, let me do a thing.
And that's one of the things we see too, is if you look at, for instance, serial killers, right? And we're looking more at the psychopathic side of things rather than sociopathic. I won't get into much of that, but people who articulate their murders the way that they do, they have their signature, they have their MO, they have their certain rituals they need to perform, right? Those things may have been influenced by cultural things, right? Or exposure to certain things. However, the impulse doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the problem. The impulse has to exist to begin with in order for those things to maybe inspire them. Like the Scream killers, the ones who took after the movie, they had to already want to kill somebody before they're going to decide, hey, I'm going to dress up like the Scream guy. You know, I mean, it's nonsensical to think that something like that causes it. And frankly, wrestling it's, I guess you can say it's glamorized violence, but the fact is that it's highly choreographed. And, you know, I mean, there's an art to it.
Yeah. It's basically a live action stunt show. Now, to a 12, 13-year-old, you don't know that. And I remember this stuff as like, because when you're that young and you're watching wrestling, every adult in the room, if you're watching with adults who do not like wrestling, they're either going to turn the channel or they're going to look at you and they're just going to be like, this is all fake.
Oh yeah.
But even to a 12-year-old, you're like, nuh-uh, it's not fake because I see it. I see it on TV. That's not fake. TV's real.
It's happening right in front of us. Yeah.
So there's I get a certain degree of like, I see where you're coming from, but also me and my friends would wrestle on like the trampoline in our backyard when we were kids.
Right.
It never occurred to us to go find someone half our size and just pummel them. And even when we did it, again, we were on a trampoline, which I'm surprised trampolines are still made this day and age, because when I think because I loved it as a kid, but I'm like, in this day of like helicopter parents, like trampolines I guess they were more safe than just letting kids go up and down the streets unsupervised, but you can really hurt yourself on a trampoline, but we thought we were safe. But even on a trampoline, we still had an understanding we're not going to knock somebody out. But to take that to Lionel, you just have to wonder how long he pummeled Tiffany, because again, she was 6, I think. 6 years old. You would probably know better than me. You've worked with kids more. I would imagine most little kids around that age, if you're pushing them or push them down, not even hard, flick them, they will probably squall.
And from the recounting by the mother, that's what was happening. In fact, she didn't go check on them, but she recalled, I think, estimated that it was somewhere between like 5 to 10 minutes. And she told them, she just yelled down for them to quiet down.
And as far as because I saw that, she only described it as, I don't know her wording, but she just described, I just thought I heard a commotion or they were doing something. But it's like, I don't know, if you're beating on a 6-year-old, it's hard to imagine, but I guess it's not, because again, I'm not one to estimate how much pain Tiffany was in. But it sounds like if we're going by what Lionel's mom says, it doesn't sound like she was at any point just squalling, which if my liver was in half, I imagine I would probably be squalling or something.
If she wasn't passed out by the pain at that point.
Yeah. And by the time the mom found her, I imagine she probably was passed out. But even while all that's going on, it's like, what kind of racket did you hear? I was like, this isn't just, I pushed her down. It's not even, I threw her. her hard. It's like, because even that would be something, but it's like, no, you're beating this girl fairly viciously.
Can we just take a step back for a second and just put it out there that they keep describing this as the mother was watching the child, but the mother was upstairs sleeping.
Yes. Going back to the spiral staircase, they were downstairs. She was upstairs. She did not have eyes on them. I don't know how big the apartment was, but again, it's just hard to imagine a 6-year-old being beaten. Even, at a certain point, yeah, she would probably pass out, but like early being punched in the gut or being thrown around, like, what did this woman hear? Like, there had to have been something.
Well, and it's also frustrating to me because it's not like with all of this documentation of the violent behavior, the bullying, the suspensions from school, it's not like she didn't know about this. And she leaves this child to watch a 6-year-old girl. It sits really uncomfortably with me.
Yeah. And that's, again, you've sort of got me there, because when I was looking into his case, now I was more concerned with writing her story out. So I looked in just very vaguely into his story. So I didn't see like the documentation of what he did. So I'm a little fascinated by that, because I always understood it to be a little bit more wishy-washy, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all.
No. And, there was actually a forensic psychologist he was called in from the Institute for Behavioral Sciences and the Law in Florida in 1999 when he was imprisoned to do an evaluation of him. And while he concluded that Lionel Tate had no mental illnesses, he did say he had, quote, a high potential for violence, uncontrolled feelings of anger, resentment, and poor impulse control, end quote.
Very, very, that's interesting. That sort of changes, because whenever I was this is why I said this was going to be more of a loose conversation. Because, yeah, I sort of had an idea of specifically how the media was treating him. But yeah, hearing that, it's like, okay, that's interesting. Because when you look up if you look up Lionel Tate and you see the basics of his case, they don't just put it out on easy to find of all this documentation, because I did at least look through like several search queries for that and just found nothing. So that's interesting that that's out there and that it's not easy to find, because you would think that would be, and it really calls into question, back then it was wrestling's fault. It wasn't Lionel's fault. And you have I guess not a lot has changed in the media in 20 years, where you have all this documentation and they're just like, yeah, we don't care. He was watching wrestling. Boom. There's our story.
Right.
It's literally what goes on today.
It goes all the way back to, Pulitzer versus Hearst and the birth of yellow journalism. I mean, sensation sells.
Yeah.
So
you don't have to tell me. So yeah. So Lionel is ultimately convicted and he is given life without parole, but then that's sort of taken back. And they ultimately convict him of, I think, second-degree murder is what they wound up going with.
Right. And they basically overturned the first-degree murder because of, like you mentioned, he wasn't evaluated before the trial. And so they decided, okay, well, we'll reevaluate based upon an evaluation being done on him. And again, at that point in time, they went to the 3 years serving for second-degree murder. And I don't know about you. He was a 12-year-old child when he committed this act. Okay. So I'm looking at life in prison without parole and thinking that's a bit extreme, but I also am looking at it and going, is 3 years enough for that? I mean, to me, there seems like there should be some middle ground, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things, because again, this is why I touched on this at the beginning, kids giving you increments of a true story. Whenever he was reconvicted on second degree, he did some sort of extra admission of, okay, I did this now. I'm admitting to this, which I've never done before, and I'm telling you this. And that was like a way to, not necessarily, maybe it was part of a plea thing that they worked out. I don't know the specifics of it, but I imagine it was. So they're like, okay, we'll get you admit to this and we'll throw out first degree and we'll get you with second. And with second degree, we're effectively giving you time served. He was still on probation or parole and he's released. And yeah, it's 2003, 2004. He's released, something
2004.
like that. Yeah. That's, again, I see the argument. If you just look at it broadly, this is a 12-year-old you convicted, putting him in prison for, 10 years, his life's over. excluding everything we know now, any 12-year-old you put in a system for 10 years in their formative years as an adolescent.
Right.
That's kind of all she wrote in terms of what happens and recidivism and that sort of stuff. But we do know lots of things about him. And it sounds like they knew these things back with the second degree thing. So yeah, 3 years is maybe, I don't know. It's one of these things where how much do you blame the media for this kind of stuff? Because the media jumps on it and the media wants their 7 pounds. And so they get the harshest sentence possible. And it's sort of the thing that I won't even get into this case, but a case that happened recently. A person was convicted on the most like first degree murder type stuff. And it's very possible this person could walk, because all that person has to do is appeal it and say, because this was a media firestorm case. And people probably know I'm not even going to say the name. It's not worth getting into. But the media went after this person. He was convicted on the biggest first degree charge, the worst thing you could be convicted of, but he has grounds to appeal it. And he can also push the media and say the media drove this. And if he gets that and he gets any kind of a fair appeal, he could straight up walk. And that almost seems to be what happened with Lionel, where the media firestorm happened. He got a 13, again, he was the first in American history, the first kid of that age to be charged and be sentenced to life without parole.
That's right. Absolutely. The youngest ever in U.S. history at that time.
Yeah. And when you do something, I mean, that's a headline that sticks. That's something that if you appeal it, and it sounds like he got a more than fair judge on the appeal. Because I want to say the judge said something to him when he basically was like, your time served and all that, to the effect of, I hope you understand. I hope you're appreciative of the break you're being given. It sounds like the judge knew this kid was getting a break. And you're like, well, maybe the kid deserved more time, but the media firestorm that went after him, if they would have just stuck to the facts, The
facts were bad enough.
Yeah, the facts are like, why did you have to point to all these other things when all you had to do was just point to, okay, here's his documented history, do with that what you will. But they just took it as they do and just made it something that it wasn't. And that pushes to get a 13-year-old life without parole. And that would probably make any judge, liberal, conservative, whatever, stop and go, is that something that we're comfortable with doing?
Right.
And it would probably make a judge want to walk back some of that, which it sounds like that's sort of what happened.
Well, and ultimately it hardly mattered. He's not in prison for life, but he violated the terms of his parole when he was supposed to be on house arrest. He ended up assaulting somebody with a weapon that could have resulted in deadly force. He breaking and entering. The guy just was all over the place. As
I recall, he supposedly had a gun. And he admitted to having a gun, but they never found the gun, that's one of those things where you put your head in that position. Like, if you didn't find it, I didn't do it. But it sounds like he admitted to it. They never found it.
Well, and the pizza guy that he pulled it on and the kid whose house or apartment he was in also testified that, he had a gun. So what he did with it, I don't know.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating. It wasn't found, to be quite honest, because you're like, how far can you go? Where can you hide a gun that in the general vicinity they're not going to go looking and find?
Right.
But yeah, he gets out. He walks from the first conviction. He gets out on parole. He's been given a hell of a break, and 8 months, 9 months, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's accused of a gun, violating house arrest, violating his parole, and is given basically concurrent sentences. I forget, I think the parole violation may have been the heaviest. I think it was like 20 years or something like that, and then 10 years for possession of the gun, but those were concurrent. So and just if for people, if you don't know what that means, and again, this is why I like doing this sort of stuff, because I studied criminal justice. So this is why, like, as much as I do love doing autopsy, I like doing this kind of stuff too, because it's just kind of interesting for people to know. If you ever hear concurrent, that means a judge could have thrown out the parole violation but he still has to sit in jail for 10 years for the possession because he's serving them concurrently. They could have stacked them and said, no, first you're going to get 20 years for this, and then we're going to add 10 additional years for that. But again, he keeps, as much as it doesn't sound like it, he keeps getting pretty fairness in the system as far as that stuff goes.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he's just a very interesting person where you just look at it and you think it almost seems like he got a raw deal, but then it's almost like, well, maybe he didn't get quite as much as he should have. And then in this day and age, it's like, well, it almost doesn't matter now because he's not getting out for another like 10 years, something like that. And it's kind of, you wonder how he'll be when he gets out because he's effectively spent most of his life behind bars at this point. And right. You wonder, I don't know what he's currently doing. I don't know if he talks to anybody. You just wonder, you're like, what do you, like, your name was everywhere once upon a time. And you've basically, as Red said, you're institutionalized now. What do you do when you get out? Hey there, fellow YouTubers. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Autopsy so far, and we'll return in just a few moments. But I wanted to take this time to let you know the various ways available to support this show. One of the easiest and cheapest ways, cheapest here meaning free, is to leave a review on iTunes. It feeds the algorithm and spreads us to more listeners. Another free way is to subscribe to this channel. Smash that subscribe button, as they say. Hit the notification bell, leave a comment below, and share our videos on social media. Autopsy is also available wherever you get your podcast: iTunes, Spotify, Google, Amazon, Stitcher, Podchaser, Good Pods, etc. If you like what we're doing here and want to support the brand, head on over to our Teespring merch shop where we have a variety of t-shirts as well as hats, beanies, hoodies, mugs, stickers, posters, and lots more. If you do, be sure to use the discount code FOULPLAY for 15% off your order. Tired of this ad already? All episodes of Autopsy are available at patreon.com/autopsypodcast, ad and promo free. Become a patron today for as little as $3 per month for early access with bonus content available as well. Also find us on buymeacoffee.com/autopsypodcast. Support and donations are never expected but always appreciated and help us keep the lights on. Links to the merch shop, Patreon, and Buy Me Coffee are all available on our website, autopsypod.com. Have a suggestion or an autopsy report for a potential episode, or a question for a potential discussion topic? Feel free to email them to autopsypodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on our Twitter page, autopsy_podcast, and say hello. Though admittedly, you'll likely just find me posting dumb jokes and memes. Same goes for our Instagram page as well, but feel free to follow along at Autopsy Podcast, and of course, facebook.com/Autopsy Podcast. Again, thank you for any and all support, and as always, thank you for listening.
Well, and that's where my concern comes in, because he very, very clearly, and I'm going to give a little disclaimer here. I am a social psychologist, but I'm not a clinician, and I'm therefore not a diagnostician. Okay. That is a completely different skill set. I deal with theory, which is one of the reasons that I kind of look at the different things and how they affect people, but I'm not giving you an absolute in terms of my personal opinion. If I do give an opinion, it is just that. It's not a diagnosis. So that being said, it concerns me because he is pretty by the book, a case of conduct disorder, which is basically the precursor to antisocial personality disorder. Conduct disorder is what they call it in childhood. Now, it's only about 25% of children who have conduct disorder that go on to have antisocial personality disorder, but that's still a pretty significant amount. That said, when you hit antisocial personality disorder, you're talking about pervasive deviance, deception, irritability, impulsivity, recklessness, and callous and unemotional traits. He meets all of those. Now, they're not exactly sure what causes conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder. Some kids who have conduct disorder just seem to have like a problem with their frontal lobe, which if we move on to adulthood, we do see those deficits as well in adults with APD or psychopathy, but it interferes with a human's ability to plan, to stay away from harm, and to learn from negative experiences. Some experts believe that a series of traumatic experiences occurs for a child to develop a conduct disorder. These experiences then often lead to depressed mood, behavioral problems, and involvement in a deviant peer group. Now, it's more common in boys than in girls, which I don't find really surprising. And it's also more likely to develop in children or teens who come from homes that are disadvantaged, dysfunctional, and disorganized. And I think those are all really important things to kind of consider when we look at Lionel Tate's home life. One of those is that he did come from a fairly disadvantaged background. His father was not in the picture. And while there are plenty of kids out there who lack a father figure and do just fine, there are others who harbor a lot of resentment about that. And so is that going to make somebody violent or behave that way? No, but resentment can add to the picture. As far as dysfunction goes, I mean, I'm just looking at the actual date of this event and what was in place there. And it seems like there was, I'm going to lump these two together, dysfunction and disorganization. Mom's supposed to be watching this little girl. She's upstairs and in bed. Lionel, having a history of violent behavior and bullying, is downstairs ostensibly supposed to be watching this child. And they have wrestling on, which I don't know about you, but when I was a 6-year-old girl, that wasn't really my jam, right? I mean, I'm saying I was into ponies and Barbies. Anyway, not that you have to be into traditional gender role stuff, but it wasn't like men slamming each other around with chairs. That's just a different kind of deal. So, but further, if we look at the mother's reaction to the charges, which I find fascinating, that may be the most interesting part of the case to me, is she's making excuses for him the entire time.
Lionel's mom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lionel's mother seems to completely disregard the fact that her son's alive and that this close family friend's daughter was killed in one of the most ghoulish ways possible. But it's Lionel's a good boy, and it was the wrestling that's the fault. The mom was on the same page as the media. And it was just like, she is supposed to be a law enforcement person, and she's still making excuses for this child. And I just think, when you have somebody who is harboring these resentments, if they have low impulse control, some of it is going to be neurobiological, some of it is going to be environmental, some of it's going to be psychological. But ultimately, if you have an enabler who's going to continue to let this person push the envelope and push the envelope and push the envelope, I mean, what are you supposed to expect from that child? And
to sort of touch on, because this sort of ties into stuff that's going on currently in terms of people, like when people get into arguments these days, politics or whatever, when you get them, if they're in a corner, the one thing that they'll start doing is, hey, I don't want to get into whataboutism. Usually when you've cornered somebody and they say, hey, let's not do what about it, that person has lost, because everybody does whataboutism.
Yeah.
And I only bring it up because this day and age, people seem to think of themselves as having very set opinions. And this doesn't, and I'm being broad here, so it's not all encompassing, but a law enforcement officer would not be a person that I would think typically is going to blame pro wrestling for someone's behavior. A law enforcement officer is going to say, no, it's this person who did it. It is their fault.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is, we all get these ideas of what we think we would do or how we would respond. And maybe Lionel Tate's mom maybe had thought a certain way about a certain thing. But when it's your kid on the line, or either your kid's dead or your kid did the thing, whatever it is, whatever you think, you can throw that out the window. When it hits you home, you don't know, because we're all going to try to blame somebody. And I just see a lot of people these days saying, I would never do that. I would never blame this. I would never blame that. It's like, you don't know. You don't know until something that terrible happens to you, or someone does something that terrible, what you would say to defend them.
Absolutely. One of the ones that just jumped out to me as you were talking about this, Ted Bundy's mother She visited him on death row. She believed in his innocence all along. And the things that were problematic, she owed to like early discovery of pornography. I'm putting it out there, bless her heart. You don't want to think that your child is a monster.
And just out of curiosity, did she think he was actually guilty of the crimes themselves?
No.
But she's still justifying it. She just...
Yes. At least she was in some serious denial.
Well, those are crazy mental gymnastics. He's innocent, but even if he was guilty... Here's the justification.
This is why. Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, I could get back into her backstory. It goes back generations as far as that's concerned. Like, I may cover her at one point, actually. Yeah. But, and I don't mean her as a predator, but her background, she was victimized in some very bizarre ways. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, it's you're absolutely right. And I almost think of it akin to like a psychological version of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, no, you're not going to do this to my kid. And so you get really defensive. Or there are some that just freeze and are like, I'm hiding away, flee, same kind of deal there. Fawn, you're trying to sort of like, it's okay. Everything's going to be okay. And I'm kind of trying to, please everybody in hopes that it won't make anything worse. And, it's very sad to me, but it is, you're absolutely right. Like when it comes to your own child, who knows?
And again, so much of this stuff, it's why, again, his case is fascinating because of the media, because of maybe Lionel Tate's mom had an opinion about something and didn't believe he was guilty, blah, 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 blah. Okay, maybe we just didn't ever need to hear her opinion. It's like, okay, we know these facts, we know this stuff, he's convicted, kind of end of story. But it's the media who is going after, like, let's give the mom and let her say whatever she wants to say and then almost play gotcha to the mom. But you're like, to what extent? If you know anything about people, okay, you caught her. You presented the facts that she didn't want to hear. Like, what does that give you? Like, this is her son.
She excused it away. The whole time with this whole wrestling fantasy because, the entries on this poor child's body, the ME equivocated to like the damage you would see on a body that was thrown from a 3-story window.
Or possibly hit by a car, like the liver lacerations. And also she had to her head, what you call the suture lines of the skull. When you're younger, they're fibrous tissue. At a certain age, when you're an adult, it's like straight up bone. It's what it develops to. But when you're very young, probably infant, it's more fibrous. It's something that can sort of be torn a bit, but she was 6 years old. So it was at least stronger than that. But still, the suture line, like one of them had sort of like been torn open, we'll say. And that takes some pressure to do.
Right.
So yeah, she was, again, the head trauma, and again, going back to what the hell the ER reported to the ME's office or to the investigator. It's like, sometimes even, and this was a curious thing I've learned doing what I did. Even after death, bruises can develop.
Right.
It's very strange if you've never seen it, because sometimes we would get a child abuse case and you really wouldn't see too much markings, and the doctor would be like, put her in the cooler and we'll let her sit for a day or two. And you'd come back a day or two and these bruises, it's just fascinating. After death, there's this developmental of the bruising, but hers was not. That's a subtle case. Hers was not. Like hers was, there had to have been blood emanating probably from her mouth or nose.
It's reported that it was even coming out of her eyes.
Yeah.
And there was a portion of her brain right where you're saying the skull suture, pieces had kind of, the suture of the skull had kind of come apart, that an entire portion of her brain looked like it had been stomped by his shoe. It was completely flat. I can't, I mean, I don't have the words. I really don't. Like, how do you not see that in an ER?
So it's possible they saw it, because thinking the way some investigators, and I'm not trying to throw shade at investigators, but sometimes if you got a really brutal case and people start walking you through it while you're on the phone in the middle of the night, or even if you're there, if it's that extensive, you might hesitate to even write any of this down. So it's possible they did that and they're just like, you know what? Whatever medical records you got, you just send them along with the body and the doctor will look at it then. Because at a certain point, it's like, okay, I can write, maybe she's got head trauma, maybe she's got this, maybe she's got that. But it's me trying to extend some sort of like, because if there's blood emanating from anywhere, you would at least note blood emanating from mouth or something like that,
right?
And possible other traumatic areas, and that's all you would have to write if you didn't want to have to get into every little thing.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So I'm just curious who took how, because every ME's office is a little different. Every investigator, some of them write very, very long, elaborate reports. Some of them are just like, I'll just write a brief summation, and once the case gets here and we look it over, I'll write my narrative then. At least where I was, it really didn't matter what kind of case it was. You had to have it in the system within 24 hours. But every office is different, and Florida can be its own beast at times.
Yeah.
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 Okay, so another reason to get Ariel on is she does what I don't do and takes pretty extensive. If you saw the notes that I have listed for this versus what she showed me before we started recording, you would strip me of my show, very likely.
I can't do what you do.
But yeah, Ariel was extra. So you had some things. Yeah. So you had some things that you saw that doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but you could probably explain it.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is the most important, I guess, is to kind of round out, because we have conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder. That doesn't necessitate somebody being a psychopath, but determining whether somebody is a psychopath can offer a lot of insight into how dangerous a person might be. Now granted, we're talking between 4 and 30% of CEOs are psychopaths, so it's not necessarily that a person's going to be dangerous, but it's an interesting thing to look into in terms of where a person stands and where they might end up going if they're in a certain trajectory. So I brought in the PCL revised, which is the Dr. Robert Hare. He was the person who invented this. It's a psychopathy checklist, and this is the revised version of it. And basically on this scale, and I remind you, I'm not a diagnostician. You do actually have to have somebody to perform the assessment in a clinical setting. They also have to be somebody who can administer an interview portion of this. However, I have basically the 20 traits that are listed to be prominent in psychopaths. Now, the traits are basically rated from a 0 to a 2, depending on the level of severity. So a 0 being they don't have the trait at all, to a 2, which is like, yeah, it's pretty evident that they have this going on. Now, the total score, the max score that you can get on this is a 40, and that is a textbook psychopath. Okay. If you're considered at 30 points or higher, you meet the criteria for a diagnosis of psychopathy. Okay. All that said, so I kind of went through and I actually evaluated all of these things insofar as we can with Lionel Tate. Because of the age that he was and the gaps in information we have, there's certain things we can't assess. We probably could now, depending on how much time he spent out of prison, etc. So the first one is glib and superficial charm. I don't really think that he showed evidence of that. Do you?
No. He seemed to only really want to answer specifically what he was being asked. He was not the charming type. Not taking him down a peg or anything. Like, he just some kids. I was this kind of kid, to be fair. I was not the kid. Like, it's like, you want to talk to me about what? No. Yes is the answer. Good day.
There are kids though who are super charming, even ones who, for instance, when I was substitute teaching at one point, there was a little boy he was a 3rd grader when I knew him. And I mean, like, if you could have given him a nickname, it would have been Troubles. Like, this kid would just get into it. everything from mischief to using foul language to like making threats against other kids. I don't think he meant them, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it wasn't like, oh, I would blah. It was, I'm going to whatever. Now, granted, this kid was one of my favorite kids to work with. And it was just, he was a charming little kid. He was funny and he was smart and he would tell jokes and he'd get this little like twinkle in his eye and a little like half grin. And you'd just be like, oh God, if you could just behave, you know? Yeah. But you like those people in spite of themselves. And that he doesn't seem like that at all to me.
No.
Next, I would say grandiose, which is sort of an exaggeratedly high estimation of themselves.
No. Well, you know more. I didn't see all the documented stuff, so
I'd give it maybe a 1. I really don't see it being
on a scale of
0 to 2.
Oh, okay.
Just kind of mid-ground, like.
Yeah. Again. I really wish I would have. This is why I don't do this kind of stuff that often. I was like, was this information that easy to find? Because I never saw it.
Look, if you know where to look, and I've gotten years of experience looking up the type of stuff that I do. There's plenty that you don't want me trying to find.
Yeah.
That'd be no help. So, let's see. Next up, I would say need for stimulation.
Oh yeah.
I'd say very high.
If he doesn't have a father figure, some people might find that a controversial take, but you need something there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, if you don't have it, why wouldn't he be watching wrestling, honestly?
Right. And that risk-taking behavior that he takes on, bullying and even assaulting other children and things like stealing, those are giving him a rush. So, I think that he was seeking stimulation pretty clearly. Pathological lying.
To some capacity, yeah. He, again, going back to the beginning, as Dr. House would say, everybody lies. And he clearly did. It is documented he lied.
His very first story was that he just gave her a bear hug.
And that's a kid thing, though. That's something where I'm like, even if this was a complete freak accident, like if you just threw someone down the stairs and they broke their neck or something, I'd say almost any kid would probably be like, I was just standing next to her and then they fell. Like,
oh yeah,
that's a kid thing. But he did. And I just don't know how much he was questioned or how much he was checked over and over. But he does give just incremental, like, okay, well, this did happen. Okay, I said this, but then this had happened. So if that's pathological, then it's pathological. I'm not the person to say.
In his documented history, you'll remember too that was one of the big ones, is that he was constantly lying.
Oh,
so, yeah. So I mean, I put that on the high end for him.
Mm-hmm.
Cunning and manipulativeness.
I don't know if I can give that to him.
I think he was manipulative. I don't know about cunning.
No, again, to see if you Google Lionel Tate, just a simple Google search, you will see it's almost like they paint him as not simple, but what's not an offensive way to say this. Not simple-minded, but just sort of not a bright kid.
Sure. He was not exceptionally, God, I'm trying to find another word but cunning. He wasn't exceptionally well planned out or, So yeah, not cunning,
manipulative. Well, he is already lying to some, he is lying. That I would almost say that goes hand in hand.
Sure. So maybe we put him at like a 1.
Yeah, that's more than fair.
Okay. Shallow affect. So superficial emotional responses. I'd say 100% on this kid.
I don't know his reactions. That'd be something I'd actually have to see video of him and see how he would react.
That's fair. Callousness and lack of empathy.
Yeah. You don't inflict that kind of damage to someone half your size. And again, that was something that I was curious about when we started this, and I was thinking a very different way about it. But I mean, it sounds like to some degree he knew exactly what he was doing.
And I think his mom enabled that You know, I mean, she was the one who originally didn't want him to take the 3-year second-degree murder plea because she wanted to take it to trial and hopefully for an acquittal. I don't know if that's just a mom wanting, I don't know, but like, it seems almost delusional to me. It's like, I mean, I think that he had an example in her. I don't think he even had to try very hard to develop empathy for anybody.
Yeah.
It was excused away his whole childhood. So, parasitic lifestyle. I don't think we can really answer that. I mean, he was a child.
What child isn't? That's dependent. Never mind. I was going to say that would sound terrible, but what child doesn't have, I'm not going to call a child a parasite. Dependent.
They're dependent. Yeah, they're dependent on their parental figures or caregivers, you know?
And since I wouldn't say cunning, then no.
Now, that's something that he could potentially grow into or has grown into. I don't know. Sure. I don't have any information on that, but I don't think we can even gauge that. Poor behavioral controls. Yep.
Even if you, even me not knowing all that other history, that's poor behavioral control just on what he did alone.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's, I think the quickest one. We've both been like, yep.
Yeah.
No question there. Sexual promiscuity. That's another one. We have no way of knowing. He was barely in adolescence.
Yeah.
You know, he's barely pubescent. We don't know. Could he have grown into that kind of behavior? I mean, a lot of times people with antisocial personality disorder are the ones who end up being sexually aggressive. So, because they don't develop interpersonal relationships, but they may very well still have sexual impulses. So, you know, you do find that, but we don't know. Right. If he did have any sort of charges for that or whatever, been swept under the rug as far as I know.
Yeah.
So early behavior problems. I think that's a solid. Yeah.
If what you got is on the money, then yeah.
Right. Lack of realistic long-term goals. I think that's another one we can't assess.
I mean, what kid has?
Exactly.
If you meet a kid with long-term goals, you almost question their psychopath.
Look, listen, I'm 37. I still am not entirely sure. Where I'm going.
Yep.
Impulsivity.
Probably.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Irresponsibility.
Yeah.
Failure to accept responsibility for own actions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the lying indicates that.
Yeah. And again, having a mom that's constantly enabling you to excuse it away to something that's not you.
Absolutely. Okay, here's another one I don't think we can assess at all. Many short-term marital relationships or marital-like relationships. He was 12 when he did this. We don't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Juvenile delinquency. Yeah, that's a definite yes. Criminal versatility. I think we have seen that. Stealing, lying, pulling a gun on somebody, beating a child to death. I mean, like, it's pretty rangy.
Now, are we diagnosing him now or as a kid?
Well, that's part of it, is
because the gun thing came later.
When he was on parole and even before he was of age, he showed a lot of that differentiation among the types of things he was doing. So, I mean, I would say yes, but
you're just specific, like having a variety of delinquent behaviors.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the last one would be revocation of conditional release, which we absolutely saw. I mean, within 8-9 months of his release, he was violating his parole. So, you know, So ultimately what that totals up to, because I think we were on the same page about all of that, including the things that we weren't able to assess. He came up about a 28.
Yeah.
And that's, again, max of 40, but 30 qualifies you for a diagnosis. So I think as he grows older, we may see him get to that number or even surpass it.
And a curious thing, because of his age, honestly, the ball is in the court of the system. It's like, if you want to have faith in the system, he's your guinea pig. Does the system work how it should? Because he's the person he's already borderlining. The system exists to you pay your debt and also try to rehabilitate. And And yeah, he's the person you need to be looking at in terms of, does the system work? Because he's already been cut several breaks and he's back, and now he's probably not going to get out. I forget what his release date was specifically. I believe 2031. Mm-hmm. He's got less than 10 years to go. So, I mean, he could always, he's as much as people would say he hasn't really lucked out. He's lucked out to some degree in terms of, he didn't luck out with the media, but because of how the media treated him, he kind of lucked out in court.
Right.
And then blew that. And now he's continued
to blow it. I mean, it's just like, and honestly, when you look at the court system, I mean, I've worked in family court, and it's not exactly the same, but we do deal with juvenile offenders there, and it's, you want to believe it's going to work, and yet there are these cases that we see time and time again where somebody's given a break and given a break and given a break and given a break, and they just keep coming back.
I did corrections for about a year, and I mean, these were grown men I was working with. I never worked with the kids. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the grown men, they'd go out, and I was in a nonviolent unit. Specifically, it was like child support or like drug charges.
Gotcha.
And they would go out. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but you would just start seeing faces back again and again and again. And you're just like, what are you doing, man?
Right. And in Tate's case, like you said, he spent more of his life in prison than not, including during some very formative years. And right now, we're largely a retributive justice system as far as corrections goes. Mm-hmm. They're not getting, the type of therapy or even trauma-informed focus that could help them out of some of these things and thought traps that they've been accustomed to. They're not taught social skills the way that they should be. They're not taught to value pro-social behavior. It's really, it's sad.
And they don't really understand. Well, I don't know. I was going to say you don't really understand privacy anymore once you're in the system. Mm-hmm. But he he had some vague understanding of it, whether he was cognizant of it when he was a kid. But again, he spent most of his life behind bars. It's like, almost like, what are boundaries at a certain point?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It doesn't sound like he had many to start with.
No.
So, but that's all I've got. I mean,
yeah. And that's about as much as I wanted to touch on with him, because again, it's one of those things where he's just a fascinating case, and it's something to look at. And I'm never, with this show and even whatever, I'm not trying to specifically like pigeonhole someone into something. And
right.
Because, he could get out in 10 years and have turned everything around. You never know.
And it's happened.
Yeah.
So,
and he would be the success story that the system should be doing commercials about from now to eternity. Mm-hmm. So it's like you hope for it, and it's not beyond me to sort of note that, like, 20 years later, you'd like to forget that, but here we are talking about it.
Right.
It's like, I understand it, but it's just a fascinating case. Again, not just him, how he was treated in the media, what they decided was important, and what they decided wasn't important. And if you know me, listeners, you may or may not, and it's neither here nor there, but sometimes I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder with the things that get thrown at people versus what's real and what's not. So whenever I saw that case, I was like, yeah, this is what Ariel and I are going to talk about.
Yeah. It was a good choice.
Yeah. All right. And with that, thank you all for listening. I kind of know what the next case or next episodes are going to be, even though I haven't started writing them yet, because that's just what I do. But yeah, if you like this kind of stuff, I'll do more of it in the future for sure. But to me, it's just a nice little break to not have to sit here and hear like the horrible ways people die every single time. And it's also a nice little, because I do the discussion episodes, and this is sort of, it's a variation of that ultimately, but a more interesting version. Or at least I hope you guys think. So with that, thank you guys for listening, and I will see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.